Welcome back to Sikistan and welcome back to our in-gym videos. Today is the best partner stretches for weightlifting. Some of the areas that we feel are most important hit for weightlifting are the ones that people could benefit the most from.
These are definitely where we see people most tight,
Yeah.
like overhead positions, front rack positions, and then quads as well. We're starting off here with one that's specific for the quads. I like this because it tends to get a very concentrated stretch on the quad,
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of people, when they're stretching their quads, they might have a small bit of flexion left in their hips, or they might be kind of pushing their knee out to the side and externally rotating their hip. So you'll see here I'm just pointing at Garth's lower back. That's what you're really watching. You're looking to make sure his hips don't shoot up towards you. So making sure his lower stomach and the front of his pelvis is flat on the floor. Then taking like a C grip on the ankle and pushing it straight into his hip. We're just removing the shoe here for ease of demonstration.
Oh, buddy, trust me, my lower stomach has always touches the floor first. The main thing with these is the reason we see a lot of weightlifters with tight hip flexors is not only due to the environments people spend most of their days in, driving or sitting, and you get that kind of permanently shortened hip flexor position, but in weightlifting, we don't actually spend a lot of time in full extension. So I know you're saying, oh, but I full extend in the snatch and the clean. It doesn't really hit that meaningful position for long enough or with enough force. It's not the same position. A lot of time you're actually leaving the ground as well when you're hitting those foot extensions, and it's very momentary. So it doesn't really counteract the huge amount of time we spend in shortened hip flexor positions. So at the bottom of the squat, when you're sitting down, when you're driving, you're at the office, you're in these positions where you're never really extending your hip flexors. And so you typically do see a lot of weightlifters with a lot of shortened hip flexors or quite chronically tight hip flexors, and oftentimes up into the psoas. The hip flexor insertion actually goes up higher than a lot of people think it does. I think a lot of people thinks it ends at the kind of the hip bone.
Yeah.
So if you wanted, you could even do a little bit of manual therapy or a little bit of a lacrosse ball, but just be careful you're not rolling any vital organs.
That's one way of getting right into the hip flexors, to get one of the kettlebells, set it on the floor in front of you and kind of drape your hip crease over it. You can get right in there.
If you're brave enough.
If you're a psycho.
Yeah, if you're a psychopath.
This next variation, it's kind of a progression on, will be to raise the knee up off the floor. So this is obviously singling out that hip flexor even more and just targeting the entire quad more as well. But I really like this. For me, like an ab mat under my knee tends to be about perfect. We can't overemphasize the importance of the hand on the lower back, or just making sure that lower back is staying flat. Because I guarantee if you try this at home, you're going to see your hips scooting up off the floor and you'll still feel a stretch, so people keep going. But you really want to be kind of pushing that pelvis down into the ground.
A lot of times what you'll see is if you have tight hip flexors and they're affecting your knees, so a lot of times things will travel downstream. So if there's a pain area, it may be up or downstream. A lot of time you'll see is after training, the tendon insertion at the top of your kneecap will start getting quite tight and painful at near the end of a session or after, or sometimes when you're driving. So that might be a good indicator that it's possibly your hips are causing a bit of an issue for that knee pain. I would as well encourage you, if you start getting that kind of pain, to start looking to address it, as it's likely to end up transforming to something a bit worse in the future.
That's when we always say most injuries don't just come out of the blue. Like in weightlifting, they don't anyway. You get these little hints, maybe 4 or 5 months or 6 months beforehand. That's one of the hints. Like if your knee is getting that kind of catatonic and painful after a session, or when you're recovering from a session, that's one of the main things you do need to look at. Okay, moving on. Next is in a kind of overhead stretch, a snatch position stretch. This is my usual go-to, right, for people if they're just kind of very, very tight overhead, particularly with CrossFitters, powerlifters and things like that. Start them off with quite a wide grip. You see we start sneaking the grip in narrower and narrower over the course of time. We've asked Rambo to bring a med ball. So what a med ball will do is basically replace that ab mat, bring the shoulders further off the ground if the mobility is very good.
So in this position, you don't actually need to worry about locking your ribs down. So a lot of times you'll hear people talking about ribs down, or if you've done the CrossFit level 1 weightlifting or level 1 CrossFit certificate, they'll talk about ribs down for the overhead squat, but that's not a realistic position. if you're testing mobility and doing test retest kind of positions, the rib down is useful because it just eliminates the other variables. But when we're doing weightlifting, if this is give you enough of a stretch, that's perfect. You're often very arched in the bottom position in the overhead, in, for example, the jerk, or more specifically the bottom of the snatch. So you are overarched there, and if you're still getting a stretch in this position, then I wouldn't be too worried about it. I think you'll often lose a lot of the benefit of the stretch by worrying too much about keeping your ribs locked down. So obviously if there's huge amounts of flaring, then you may need to look at reducing or sort of kind of progressing the exercise a little bit slowly. But if there's a moderate amount of flare in the ribs, I don't think it's a huge issue, to be honest. You're looking for a specific stretch. You're not looking for massive transfer over and massive specificity. You're just looking for end range of motion in your shoulders.
What I really like here is, if I'm the person holding the stick, is that Owen would bring his shoulders down into a low position and I kind of hold the stick there for him, and he can relax those the main kind of muscles in his back that he's used to pull the stick down. And then we're mainly just allowing the shoulders to sit in that position for maybe a minute, 30 seconds. Obviously, we're not going to hold it for a minute here, but that's what I really like to see, is just Owen squeezing back into that good position, me holding it there. He can relax those kind of subscaps and the back of his delts, and then he's just loosening out that anterior of the shoulder.
Okay, so here is just essentially the reverse position, and I would definitely encourage you, if you have that gym partner, if you're lucky enough to have gym friends for these stretches, is reversing the position and hanging down through it. I actually find this one, if you have already good range of motion in your shoulders, this is a better one for that. So the hanging one is more passive. Always when you're stretching as well, especially these kind of drills, is you're not forcing anything. You can get in range of motion, but you're likely to have other unwanted effects from that. Whereas if you allow that passivity to happen, so just kind of ease into that stretch over a longer period of time, you're more likely to keep it, and it's less likely to be very, very uncomfortable. And if you're less uncomfortable, you're likely to hold it for longer, and so you're more likely to get more benefit from the stretch.
Probably the only other thing to note here is, like, when you're holding onto that stick, if you're the person who's being stretched out, you're the stretchee, make sure you just keep like the hook of the heel of your hand looped over the bar. Don't hold onto it in like the same way you'd hold a barbell. So a lot of the time our wrists will go limp, and then we can kind of get this false sense of moving that bar very far back. It's like having weak wrists overhead in your snatch or your jerk. You'll be able to push the bar further back behind you. Ideally here, and you'll see my wrist is kind of just sitting up on top of the bar. That's what you want. Just keep your elbows locked out. You don't have to use any energy then to keep you stretching or keep you held onto the bar.
Remember, always with these stretches, the partner dictates how far and how much force is going through something. So if someone says stop, just stop immediately. Someone says hold it there, hold it there. Don't push things too far.
And it's interesting we say that, Garth, because now we see an extreme amount of pain being inflicted on my quads.
With
absolutely no force.
You are...
My quads are just very, very tight, so any amount of pressure here at all is pretty sore. I like to put something under the knee just to stop any kind of hyperextension as Garth stands down on top of them, but this is very, very useful for the overly tight quads, hamstrings, glutes, calves, all that stuff can really be helped a lot by this.
Here's Fitz just being an absolute baby as well. So foam rolling and soft tissue work has gotten a very bad rap in the last few years. Originally when we started, there was nobody doing any kind of soft tissue work other than elite athletes who had masseuses. And then Kelly Starrett and all these other, everyone kind of took off from there. And now it's swung back in the other direction, where a portion of people online are significantly against it and say it doesn't do anything. And to be honest, oftentimes these are people who maybe don't get any benefit. Sometimes they're just people who don't train that hard and don't have these issues. But there is definitely, in the literature, things are no longer, they don't call them scar tissue anymore. They don't call them, they don't think it's actual scar tissue. Scar tissue takes a very long time to build up. What they do call these is, I think it's adhesion points. They used to call them kind of trigger points. But I think adhesion is the vocabulary they use in the literature at the moment. They're identifiable in the muscle tissue. It's something they've been at for a few years, and certainly people will have less pain in a joint under certain circumstances if you remove these. And I'm doing bunny fingers here. You can remove them through a variety of different means. These receptors respond to different kinds of stimulus. And one of the very good ways of removing these adhesion points is through manual therapy or soft tissue work. Now, it doesn't have to be uber aggressive. You're just looking for a change in stimulus at that particular point in the muscle fiber, and so you'll get feedback through the whole system, and it will let your body know that something needs to change in that area, and thankfully that often results in a more positive effect for us.
Particularly in this case, where my quads are really tender, you don't want to be putting all your weight down through the stick. I know you'll see Chinese weightlifters and they'll be running up and down their quads, really pressing hard. They'll have both feet on the quads, but you can tone this up or ramp this up and down. You know, it's not just on or off. You can go quite softly and quite calmly with it, or else you can actually ramp up into it if you need to.
So the prisoner stretch is a great one. External rotation is something no weightlifter has enough of. Unless you're a professional athlete, everything you usually do during the day is fighting against you. Just look at your phone, sitting at your desk doing your work, studying at your desk. All of these things are just reinforcing your lack of external rotation, and it's so useful in the overhead position for healthy shoulders, and it's the one you've got to look after and be on top of.
Yeah, 100%. Even watching this video, if you're watching it on your phone, your TV, your laptop, you're probably internally rotated right now. It just tends to be a position we'll always push towards. Like, natural anatomical position will be standing straight up with your chest out and your palms faced forward, which almost nobody will stand like that.
The worst part about external rotation is it's the hardest one to stretch by yourself unless you have a very specific setup.
Yeah.
Stretching external rotation meaningfully, unlike your hips, for example, or your ankles, are all things you can do very, very easily. But external rotation, in the absence of, if you're in an empty room, it's very hard to stretch your external rotation by yourself.
So hard. The doorway stretch kind of gets you there.
Only if you've terrible levels of external rotation.
I was just about to say, if you're very tight, it kind of gets you there.
Mm-hmm.
So the last thing, this probably applies more to the slightly more yakid of male lifters, but a lot of people struggle with their front rack mobility. This is just probably the most useful front rack mobility drill. Definitely the easiest one to get into. Here we have Teddy Nyan rambling in with a can of Monster.
So in this scenario, I'm pushing down against Lara's hand. Lara's pushing up against it. So it's one of the techniques you'll see good neuromuscular therapists using. So you'll essentially apply force in the opposite direction to what you'll end up stretching. And this way, you'll often end up inhibiting the antagonist muscles and allowing you to get a greater stretch and range of motion. And the idea of stretching is the more time you spend in pushing that, hopefully, the more you'll end up, the more range of motion you'll end up after. And if you do it frequently enough, you'll embed that new range of motion, and if you keep that stimulus applied, hopefully you'll keep that range of motion and be able to do something useful for others in your sport.
So thanks very much for watching. As always, we'll ask you to give suggestions for videos you want to see us doing in the gym. We'll try and do more of these in gym style videos. So if you have exercises, like top 5 exercises for X, Y, or Z you want to see, put them in the comments down below. We would really appreciate if you subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed, like the video, and just comment down below. Thank you.